Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the MindsetGo radio show, and it's a show about conversation intelligence. And, I really decided to dedicate this show to conversation intelligence because the more and more individuals and companies and leaders I'm working with, I find we spend so much time talking about different communication scenarios they encounter, different conversations that they have to have that are problem-esque and challenging. And so it got me thinking, why don't people communicate more? And then, of course, you ask that to anybody. What has happened to face-to-face communication? Why don't people communicate more? And what happens? Of course, it's the phones. It's the cell phones. It's the texting. It's the social media. Everybody wants instant gratification and quick responses. And you know what? That's a part of it. There's no question about it. But it's way deeper than that. And a lot of it comes down to people not knowing how to have certain conversations. And think about scenarios like this. I was talking to my partner in crime, Ted, before the show, and he was talking about under-communicating and over-communicating. So think about this, right? When you're making a decision on whether to talk to someone about something, how to talk to them, whether to do so, do I over-communicate? Should I say this? Should I not say this? How will they take it? Will they think I'm being high maintenance? Will they think I'm being Will they think I'm overreacting? Will they think I'm being pushy? All these questions start to filter in. Oh, yeah, I better not do that. So now I'm in under-communicate mode. So better not say anything because I don't want to trigger them and I don't want them to react. But the problem with under-communicating, that right there, under-communicating, is one of the greatest factors that is contributing to a lot of anxiety, stress, and emotional problems people are having. Because Ted, what happens when you under-communicate? You internalize. Absolutely.
You're also blocking the person from contributing to the communication because they're going to say, he just wants to be simple and doesn't want to get into the meat of it.
Well, Ted, I love what you just said because when we make that decision of what we want to say, how we want to say it, if we want to say it, we're cheating the other person, right? That's a great point.
And yourself.
And this all came about because of an incident that happened with me this week. And Ted, I got to tell you, speaking of triggers and emotional intelligence, there's nothing that upsets me more than when I have a weak moment of communication, and I have them. I'm just like everybody else. I'm flawed. When I have a weak moment of communication, the other person says to me, oh, well, for a communications expert, that wasn't very good.
Well, look, it's never appropriate to ridicule or be rude. So if a person turns to you and says something like that, it's because of their own inadequacy.
Well, I'm glad you said that because that's where we're going to start the show today. And one of the points I want to make before I transition to what Ted was just talking about is if you think of an athlete who excels at a sport, when they have a bad game, does the coach walk up to them and say, well, I thought you were really good at what you do? No, people have weak moments. People are vulnerable. People can react at times. So here's the scenario. The scenario is that when you see an argument ensue, and I'm going to use as a starting point, I'm going to use the sport of hockey as an example.
Okay.
Two guys on the ice, one guy hits the other, which is pretty acceptable in hockey.
Yeah, that's part of the game.
Okay? The other guy punches the offender, but the referee only sees that.
Right.
And so how many times have you heard kids in a schoolyard, athletes in a game say, well, he started it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so what I realized, Ted, driving here today is this he started it or she started it mentality, we use it with physical violence, but we don't use it with emotional interactions. Okay? And so here's what I mean. So, Ted, you were just talking about when someone insults you or when someone accuses you. So the incident I had with someone this week is someone called me out on something. Not only did they call me out on something, the way they presented it accused me of misleading them, which I did not do. So the way it was presented was, I said something, I tried to clarify something and explain it, and the person came back to me and said, well, I feel like you were misleading me. And so let's stop right there. The question is, when you get accused, when you feel like you need to justify an action or a behavior, this is when emotional intelligence tends to go out the window.
Right.
So when I react, Ted, and my whole demeanor changes, and I said, I'm really offended that you just accused me of that because I have very high morals and core values, and I don't mislead people. So I take umbrage to that. So here's what happens now. It's now about me, right?
Yeah.
So now the person's intent in this conversation, which was to say something far different than how it came out, puts me in. So now I look like the bad guy because A, now I'm mad. B, I'm making it about me. So then the conversations start to deteriorate. And so then what it comes down to is in the post debrief of that conversation, when emotions cool, this person says to me, I don't think you handled that really well. I think I really wish you could have heard me. And so I said, me too. I said, the problem for me is that when you insulted me, I wasn't strong enough to remain emotionally intelligent in that moment and do what I teach people to do. Mm-hmm. And so I reacted and didn't respond. But the question is, who's at fault? Who's got the ultimate onus of communication? So in the hockey fight, person hits, person responds, but you're the one seen. In a conversation or a conflict, you throw the first blow, even though I was the actual offender of whatever that was, all bets are off. Who's the onus of communication on?
Well, it's easy if you see the first punch to know who started it.
Well, and think about this. In the case of a schoolyard or a hockey fight, there's a witness. In the case of a private conversation, it's if the offender sees, right? It's the offender themselves. So can the offender equally be emotional intelligent, step back? So when you say someone misled you and then the offender gets disappointed, frustrated, whatever, can you then also pause, take a step back and go, oh, well, you know what? That's not exactly what I mean. Can I rephrase that? Right?
Right. It's their responsibility to clarify if there was some misinterpretation, especially when it comes to somebody who is there to demonstrate standards. Well, the conversation was about standards.
Well,
and if that's a whole nother conversation, I realize, but you're absolutely right. The onus is on the person who throws the first accusation.
And I want to say that, Ted, have you ever had someone in your life that you would put in a category of they bring out the worst in you? Because of how they act to you, treat you, whatever, you could say this person tends to bring out maybe not the worst, but not the better sides of you, either or both.
Yeah. Fortunately, but unfortunately, I was brought up with lots of resources. And so money never really meant that much to me until I didn't have it. And when I was a young person, it was all about respect for me. My currency was respect. And if someone showed me disrespect, I would make it a game. I wasn't very nice.
Well, the reason why I ask is because that statement alone, when you say someone brings out the worst in you, is an implication that another person is doing something to you that you're allowing to have happen.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely right.
And so when I think of this, he started it, she started it, I come back to the same phrase, and I said this to this person. I said, it's not a he started it, she started it. It's not a he said, she said. It takes two to tango. So whenever there is a breakdown of communication, whenever there is a conflict, the first thought that should go into your head is, what was my role in this? Because you're always going to think what the other person's role is. That's going to be a reflex reaction.
Right.
But what was your role in it? What could you have done differently? And I think that when it comes to emotional intelligence, part of the challenge, I think, for leaders and companies to embrace this concept is because there's a hierarchy, and the assumption is that all of the responsibility falls on the person in charge, just like all of the responsibility falls on the offender in the beginning of the conversation. And I think we have to create a culture where if there's an employee and there's a leader, both sides, there's an expectation around emotional intelligence. Where I think the leader has the onus and the responsibility is they have to model the behavior. Because when you're in a position of hierarchy or leadership,
That's the job.
That's the job. You're a role model. You have to do that. And I think a lot of people resent that, because it's like it feels like it's an extra burden or responsibility, but that is such a primary part of being a leader. So, when we come back from our first break, I wanted to set the tone for today and all future shows, and I want to make one other comment before we head into break. When I talk about conversation intelligence, a lot of people instinctively think, oh, right, when it's a conflict, when it's a difficult conversation. No, it's way bigger than that.
Yeah.
And when I come back from the break, I'm going to talk about other ways conversation intelligence comes into play, and we're going to explore more about default reactions. So this is Mark Altman for the MindsetGo Radio Show. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to the MindsetGo Radio Show. I'm your host, Mark Altman, and if you'd like to call in and talk about some different communication or conversation challenges you have, please call in at 508-871-7000.
That's 508-871-7000.
Feel like when I say that, Ted, and I love that you repeat it, I got that jingle in my head, 1-800-54-GIANT. Like there's all these, jingles that come to my head.
Yeah.
So, but don't call 1-800-54-GIANT.
No. It's 508-871-7000.
So I want to pick up where we left off, and we're talking about conversation intelligence. And so I want to create a mindset and some awareness on some of the conversations that don't necessarily have to do with conflict.
Okay.
And I want to shift so much of conversation intelligence, Ted, is that having the type of conversation that can get people to embrace change, motivate them, it's influence them in a certain way. And I want to talk about some of those examples of conversation intelligence. And so often we see in a corporate environment that either at an organizational level where there are changes in policies, procedures, could be health benefits, it could be different perks the company offers. There's changes. Companies evolve and undergo change all the time. But when those changes are communicated at an organizational level, how are they communicated? Are they communicated as an email blast generically out? Does the CEO sit in front of the whole company and review and discuss the changes and offer people an opportunity to ask questions and voice their concerns? Do they have their departmental managers or leaders do it? There's lots of different choices. And this is what I mean about conversation intelligence. So when you're communicating a change to a human being, small changes, big changes, it's an art form. It's not just, oh, hey, by the way, this is happening, because that's what affects company culture and employee engagement, how you deliver the news, how you offer the news of change. And so one of the ways, Ted, we see this a lot, in addition at an organizational level, is what about when you have to communicate to your clients a change in pricing, a change in service level, support being offered? And so I'm now thinking of a huge level of conversation intelligence is change. And I wanted to ask you, Ted, when you look at, can you think of a time in your career where someone had to break some news to you, big or small, where you kind of shook your head after and you were like, you got to be kidding me?
Unfortunately, yes. I have had that experience, and it still stings to think about it. Let me just give you an example. I had blown out the quota by 600%. I was celebrated by the people in my group, and my group received an email saying that the division had been shut down and that we didn't need to come back to work the next day.
A generic email, just to confirm.
Packages would be going out to our home address.
Okay.
And I remember thinking, okay, this is my reward for blowing out the quota. And this is my reward. And then I started, okay, well, maybe it isn't just about me. And I went around the room. There was about 8 of us in this group, and every one of them felt the exact same way. And it made me think of good old Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message. They were telling us really what they thought of us by sending an email
Big time.
to let us go.
And frankly, Ted, to your point, in that email, it could have been the most perfectly crafted email in the history of man. Didn't matter. Doesn't matter, because it's the medium and it was the way the message was delivered.
Correct.
Right?
Absolutely.
So what's interesting about communicating change is so when we're talking about conversation intelligence, it's very easy. I'm sure a lot of you listening today can relate to the concept of changes in policies, procedures, pricing, service. But you know what? When it really comes down to it, it's changing in expectations. And more importantly, knowing how to communicate your expectations to people. And I'll give you a perfect example, Ted. I was working with a client this week, and the person said to me, here's a challenge I'm having. I'm having a challenge with employee engagement in meetings. I don't feel like my employees are really engaged in the meetings. So I said, okay, that's fine. My first question, Ted, was, what do you want them to do that they're not doing?
Right.
Okay? And he said, well, I ask them updates on projects or tasks they're working on. I want them to give me an update. I want them to tell me if they're having any issues with it, if they anticipate any delays. I just want them to give me an overall update. I said, boy, that seems really reasonable. And so he said, right. And I said, no. I said, so here's what I see the problem is. Number one, have you actually assumed they realize what you want them to tell you? Or have you actually done either one of two things? Have you actually modeled for them and say, look, let me give you an update on something I'm working on. Let me share with you the kinds of things. This is what I would like to hear from you. One. Or two, have you actually created a process and said to them, hey, in the future when you come to these meetings, can you be prepared to discuss the following criteria related to your project? And so these conversations, so much of conversation intelligence is we tell ourselves, we assume, we feel like we've actually communicated things we really haven't. And so I said, you don't have a problem necessarily with employee engagement in a meeting. You have a problem with setting expectations and making it clear what you want and need.
You're so much nicer than me. I would say to the guy, what, you expect people to read your mind?
Well said.
I mean, come on.
Well said.
I mean, you got to define terms. You have to create a format for those terms to be shared. And then you have to have a analysis process. What does that mean?
Well, Ted, and to your point, when I hear of the phrase, I can't read your mind, that's basically the passive-aggressive way of saying, or not passive, it's just the aggressive way of saying, you need to tell me because I can't guess.
What is it you want?
What do you want?
Right.
And so we started out when we were talking about conversation intelligence and looking at over and under communicating. So when it comes to having the conversations to communicate what you want, what you need, what you expect, and very importantly, the why that goes with that, that's a whole different level of conversation.
Right.
And you know what I see, Ted, is I see that I'm going to go back to the point I made about hierarchy. So if you're in a position, if you're a boss, if you're a teacher, or if you're a parent, or if you're a coach, if your mentality is, you need to do this because I said so, and I know you wouldn't say something like that in the workplace, but it's inferred, right? It's in many cases, I'm the boss.
Often body language.
Right? So the mentality of you need to do this because I said so, which by the way, Ted, I think that's a great point because it is communicated by body language a lot. Then that's a problem. Because I honestly don't have to do anything. I had a sales rep at a company last night email me, and he said, I'm not going to have time to do blank. Is that okay? And my response was, absolutely, because you have choices, just like I have choices. So the way you choose to manage your time the way you choose to prioritize what's really important to you personally and professionally, I can't manage that for you. You have to make those decisions. And so he understood. But my point is, a lot of people might think I'm trying to make them feel guilty. And that's not what I'm trying to do at all. I'm saying you're a big boy. You got to make your choices.
You got to think.
You got to think. And every day when we decide what conversations we want to or need to have, I've read some study, Ted, that we make something like 152 decisions a day. And so many of those decisions, to me, are how and what you're communicating to, people. And I really feel like that being articulate about what you want, need, and expect is so challenging for people because they don't have the experience. They've never been in a position where they've been asked to give the feedback, where they've been empowered to do so. So when they encounter an environment where that's an option and available, I think they're lost. Yeah. Ted, when I tell you, and I will not exaggerate this, I promise, when I tell you that when I hire, let's say over the course of my career, I've hired 100 people, just for the sake of argument, okay? When they work directly for me, in the first day, the first hour, one of the first things I say to them is, please don't ever sit at your desk and feel like you're a burden. Don't ever feel like you don't know how to handle something, you don't know how to solve something, and I'm going to be frustrated because you came and asked. If you do that, I will be much more upset that you're doing that than as if you had come and asked. Ted, every time I say that to people, they're, of course, shaking their head. Yep, okay, got it. Never, ever happens. No. Because they've never been in a culture where that's been encouraged and supported. So even if they know it's the right thing to do, and even though they want to people please in many cases, they still can't bring themselves to do it.
Yeah. It's used as I think, a method in our culture to dissuade people from speaking. Oh, I really want your opinion, and I really want it, but not right now. We can have a meeting about it later. And so they're put off. So they start to believe that it's best not to say anything.
Well, and what happens, I think, is you can say it. I can say it. But the proof comes in when they come talk to me and ask me, am I actually supporting my words? Am I modeling the behavior? And I think what happens a lot of times is, and this is the whole, I brought this up on previous shows, this is the whole open door policy. Leaders will say the right thing, come see me if you have a problem, concern me. But then when the time comes, maybe they're not even being mean back, but they're not available.
Right.
And they don't make the time to do it.
Right. And so it's interpreted as disingenuous.
That's right. And from a conversation intelligence perspective, once you lose that trust, credibility, and authenticity, again, it's like what you said about the email you got. It doesn't matter how nice that email was. It doesn't matter what they say. If you don't follow through and you can't actually act your words, you've lost. Yeah. So when we come back from the break, we're going to continue talking about conversation intelligence, and we're going to shift it to a different gear. And again, please stay tuned. We'll talk about default reactions. This is Mark Altman for the Mindset Go radio show. We'll be back. Ted, we're back.
We are.
Third segment, Mindset Go radio show. And, I was thinking of something during the break. I was thinking of the example I was giving where when you ask people to feel comfortable communicating if they weren't in the culture or haven't been empowered before, and I thought about that, and I thought, think of how much communication could change with two people in a corporate environment when every time you ask someone to do something and you didn't know their previous pattern, history, track record, if they've done it before, if you just said after you asked, hey, by the way, have you done that before? Because if not, I can certainly help you. We can walk through it. That one question is barely asked. And when you don't ask it, that triggers. So now you've given someone a project or a task. You don't know their skill set or experience doing it. They come back to you. They haven't met your expectations. They've disappointed. Yeah. And so part of conversation intelligence, Ted, to me, is it's not actually a whole conversation. It could be a sentence. It could be a phrase. But you know, what it comes down to is this. I could be the greatest trainer in the world, and I say this in my trainings. I can tell you all the right ways to do it. Even when I tell you all the right ways to do it, it won't always work because there's no foolproof method that always works. You have to have situational awareness. But at the end of the day, if I give you the secret sauce and you don't use it and you don't practice it and you don't learn it, it doesn't matter. And so I think a lot of times when people are learning something new, they go to a class, they go to a training, they go to a coaching session, and they want the answer. They want the golden chalice. Just tell me what I need to do differently. Mm-hmm. But then you tell them, and they don't remember. There's a part two.
I don't like that.
Yeah.
What's the other part?
Yeah. Well, that's true. So they either don't like or don't feel comfortable with what you explain. But even when they do, they got to remember when you go back to your office. And I'll tell you, Ted, one of the biggest aspects of what I've heard from our clients of what differentiates our training is how we focus on continuous and sustained learning. And so we do something called practice management. So if I'm doing quarterly trainings or monthly trainings, instead of coming in every month overloading with a new topic they have to learn, in the odd months, we'll do practice management and refresh on the topic they just did. We do, one of the big discoveries I made, Ted, about people because they have such trouble advocating for themselves is when I used to finish a training and tell people, hey, you know what, we're friends now. And this was authentic. We're friends now. Here's my card. If you ever run into any communication challenges that you need some help with, just give me a call. No charge. Happy to help. And so I finally, after doing that for about a year, I started to make the joke and said, you know why I offer it? Because no one ever takes advantage of it. So I look like a hero and no one takes it. It doesn't hurt me.
There you go.
So what I did, though, to address that is I realized, why does that happen? Why do people turn down support and mentorship and nurturing? It's for a few reasons. One, because when they're in a situation where they don't know the best way to handle something, or they try handling something a certain way, you have to have the presence of mind to A, recognize if it actually worked, and B, if you're not sure if it worked, you'd actually have to make a note and say, oh, I better ask someone about this. And people just aren't wired to do that.
No, people don't want to ask because they're afraid of being interpreted as weak or not informed, hip, part of the scene. And that's a normal human trait, and you have to get over it. You know the thing you said about training salespeople? I would always start the meeting this way. This is what we're going to cover in this meeting. Let's recover what we went over in the last meeting. And, at that point, I'd tell a joke, then ask everybody about their week and how their performance was in terms of their quota, and wait for somebody in the classroom to say, well, Ted, you said we were going to recover something. I don't remember what we did so that would get the meeting going. Because if I start the meeting, then I'm up there like Sister Mary Elephant.
But do they do that consistently?
It's not. It depends on the time of day and whether or not they've had their muffin and coffee. If you get them after lunch, it's very unlikely that you're going to get any responses from people. They're still digesting. If you get them 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 9:30 in the morning, those are the prime times for training.
So that doesn't surprise me. That's a great story and doesn't surprise me. So I promised when we went into our second break, I'd talk about default reactions. So I want to transition to I see how I heard myself there.
Very good.
I listened to myself.
Yeah.
Wasn't that impressive? When I think of default reactions, here's what I'm talking about. Part of having good emotional let me back up a minute. I believe it or not, sometimes I'm asked the question, to have conversation intelligence, what are the qualities and characteristics that you need? And to me, there's 3 very clear ones that stand out. And then I'll get into default reactions. I'm trying to build a suspense, Ted, for the default reactions.
No, I got you. Keep going. This is great.
So one of them is something we talk about on the show all the time, is emotional intelligence, right? To have good conversation intelligence, you have to have good emotional intelligence. The second one is multi-generational intelligence. And how that plays out is when you're communicating with someone who is coming from the perspective of a different generation, a different knowledge base, a different experience level, you have to adapt your communication accordingly. You know, an example I'll give is very often when I start a sales call, I will actually jokingly say to someone, would you prefer, while we're talking today, would you prefer I act as the role of an educator, advocator, or order taker? And they say, well, what do you mean by that? Which is what I'm hoping they'll say.
Yes.
And I say, well, if you know a lot about emotional intelligence and you've had a lot of experience with training, then I'm not going to do a lot of explaining of that because you already know. If you don't, so that's the order taker. The educator is they don't know much. It's the advocator. People are like, well, what do you mean by advocator? The advocator means that they are on board with what I'm talking about in the approach, but they have other people in their decision-making group that aren't, and I'm going to team up and collaborate with them to influence and persuade for both of our agendas to move through. And so, you know, when I say multi-generational intelligence, I'm saying you have to know, again, what generation, skill set, knowledge, experience level, because your communication's totally going to vary based on that. So that's what I mean. Those are key ingredients in conversational intelligence. And the third one, which Ted, my therapist to this day, I say to her every time I see her, she'll say to me, I look at her and I say, so you're telling me that the key to habit change is mindfulness. There's got to be something more. That's it. She's like, yep, that's what I'm telling you. So that's the third, is being mindful that you're going to put into play the right way, what you're going to practice it. You're going to be mindful of how you're acting, how they're acting. And so that's what it takes. So when it comes to default reactions, here's what I specifically mean. Default reactions, if Ted and I are friends, so if I do something to him, let's say we were supposed to have lunch together and I blow him off, Ted's default reaction is going to be based on whether A, he's had that experience before, B, how often he's had that experience before, and C, the level of person he's had that experience with. So if I blow him off for lunch, his default reaction could be, if he's experienced this, oh, here we go again. See, I can't count on anybody, you know? And why do I ever plan anything in the first place? And why do I plan with him? This could be the first time. Ted and I could have had lunch together 20 times. And it's the first time I've ever acted that way. But if his default reaction is to remember his baggage, and that's going to distract him, so that's what I mean by default reaction.
Yeah.
And, you know,
it's unfortunate. I hear exactly what you're saying, but people will immediately internalize the circumstances around them. And here we are back with Marcus Aurelius. If we could only accept that we can control what's going on inside ourselves and we cannot control the things that are going on outside ourselves, then our lives would be much better.
Well, in the situation I brought up earlier in the show where I was accused by someone of misleading them, this is what happened. What happened is they had a track record of dealing with people who did things similar to what it was perceived that I did. So the person went from 0 to 60. It was as if the world ended when this was really an isolated minor issue. Yeah. And as we go into...
They went to their safe place.
They went to their safe place. And as we go into commercial, I'm going to leave everyone with a thought before we go into commercial. And that is that when you default to that reaction, the challenge you have is if you can't see what's really going on and you react so much, then you're perceived as high maintenance, and then that becomes a vicious cycle. When you're not actually high maintenance, you're just triggered by that specific incident.
Right, you got a reputation.
So it's a vicious cycle. Yep. So we will be back. This is Mark Altman for the MindsetGo radio show, all about conversational intelligence. Give it up for Leonard Skinnard. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to the MindsetGo radio show for our final segment. She said, I feel so energetic and fired up today. I wonder why.
It must be the weather.
Well, I have to share a couple of things. First of all, there is, for those of you out there who have HBO, I've got to recommend one of my two favorite comedians are Brian Regan and Gary Goldman. And Gary Goldman is a guy who's traveled the country. He's been on, Conan and, and Jay Leno back in the day. Anyway, He's from Peabody. He's a local guy.
Local guy.
And he, tremendously funny. His shtick is about food and making fun of food and everyday stuff. It's really good. Anyway, to make a long story short, he became significantly depressed. And he literally to the point of he couldn't get out of bed. And so he just did an HBO comedy special, and there's nothing like it in its kind. It's basically talking about his depression. But he does it in a way where he includes his mother and his therapist, and it's hilarious. And he's fun, like it's funny, it's comedy, but he incorporates his experience in sharing. So for those of you out there who have experienced any kind of anxiety or depression, I'm telling you, you must watch this. It is just tremendous. Gary Gulman, Gulman, tremendous. And Ted, I have to tell you, odd segue, but I have to tell you, you know why I think I'm really fired up today, beyond I'm so passionate about this stuff anyway? This Saturday is my son's bar mitzvah.
That's great.
So I'm really excited to see a lot of family and friends.
And the
see
look
him.
in his eyes.
The look in his eye. So, as a matter of fact, I said yesterday, we were doing a rehearsal, I said to the rabbi yesterday, I said, I give you 10 to 1 odds he trips walking up onto the... I said, there's not a doubt in my mind.
That's beautiful.
He's like, Dad, thanks for the faith.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, you won't trip. So, in any event, okay.
Oh, we all have.
Back to business. Okay, so in our final segment, what I wanted to bring up, okay, is, and because we're gonna continue this topic for the next several weeks, and what I wanted to bring up is I want our audience to be thinking about something prior to our next show, and I want you to think about what are the things that really upset you and frustrate you, and when I ask you to do that, there's a few instructions that go with it. The first instruction is those things, that list of things, is going to be different based on the different relationships you have. So I would bucket it in 4 categories. What are the things in the workplace? What are the things with close friends? What are the things with your parents, depending on your age? And then the other category, maybe your boss specifically, maybe siblings, whatever. And think about, are they the same with everybody, or are there some differences? And there should be some differences because people have different issues with different kinds of people. And I want you to really take 15 minutes to make the list. And after you make the list, and we're going to talk a lot about this next week, ask yourself why. Why do those things upset you? And one of the mistakes, these are called triggers, but one of the mistakes people make when they start reflecting on this and making lists to understand why their thoughts are the way they are, the mistake they make is they only look for significant things. So, for instance, right? So, for instance, they'll say, "Oh, well, when someone belittles me or makes me feel awful about myself." Well, okay, I think most people would agree that that's going to trigger them. When you're triggered, you'll know you're triggered not just because you're feeling the emotion of anger. You could be feeling the emotion of disappointment. Your mood could change. Your energy could change. Your motivation level could change. And that's not always by big things. It could be little things. And Ted, I brought this up on the show before. When I'm communicating with people, when someone rolls their eyes at me, it really, even to this day, even though I know that's a trigger, and I know it's such a sign of open and outward disrespect, that it gets me.
People are very rarely aware of their body language, which makes it a great tell. And if you are mindful, again, I don't like that word, I know I'm supposed to, but if you're thinking before you speak and you're challenging yourself to consider what you're going to say before you say it, then your life is going to be much better, and it's going to be much easier to cull those negative things out of your life.
Well, and it's funny because where you're just going to, it was funny when my son was reading yesterday from the Torah and reading his speech, he was going very fast. He couldn't really, there's no intonation or inflection or anything. So I said to him, you know what's a good trick to slow down is to really articulate every word. So I would say to him, So let me give you an example, Cole. It's important to be succinct. And so I'd have him really sound out. And he looked at me and gave me a look, and I'm like, listen.
Oh, Dad.
You get the point, right? It doesn't have to be embellished, but that's something that can slow you down. And the analogy I'm making is whether someone rolls their eyes at you or whether someone belittles you, whether it's their words or their body language, if you could build in not just a pause, more than a pause, build in a pause where you said something like to yourself first, geez, I wonder why they reacted that way. And if you could literally just pause and say that to yourself, that could solve a portion of your challenges.
We have interns that come from an organization called Dynamy in Worcester.
Yep.
And every time I work with the intern in front of a microphone, I start by saying these words. If it sounds slow to you, then it's just right for your audience. And they, some of them looked at me like cross-eyed, like, what are you talking about? Because their world is rapido, very staccato, and it bites you if you go too slow. People think you're slow. Whereas when you are performing or looking to communicate effectively, you need to slow it down and occasionally add one of those pregnant pauses.
Well, and this ties back into what we talked about earlier in the show, which is, and the reason why I'm talking about what are these things that upset you, who with, when does it upset you, so on and so forth, is because this ability to have this recognition affects your conversation intelligence. Yeah. Because if I gave you a 5-step process to talk to someone when they disappointed you or when they didn't meet your expectations or when you needed to have them, embrace change, you could feel the most confident person in the world going into that conversation, feel like you have all the steps, the template, and then all it takes is an eye roll or all it takes is some kind of word choice reaction, and that all goes out the window.
Right.
So that's why having the awareness of these things that trigger you. And what's interesting, Ted, is so much. I'm going to give our listeners some things to stimulate some thoughts about this so they can do their homework before next week's show.
All right, lay it on me.
So there's 2 categories. I'm going to do the real simple category first. Here are some examples of things that can trigger people. One of them is being asked to do something you don't want to do. 2, feeling stuck to an obligation. Another one is having somebody else control your time. Now, let's just talk about those 3 for starters. That is all under one umbrella, and it's called freedom. And when someone impacts freedom or control of your time or control of your decisions, that's a huge trigger.
No, liberty is dear.
Liberty is dear. So, again, when you look at what are those things that really upset you, understand that it's not just that they're asking you to do something you don't want to do. The root cause is it's impacting your freedom. So that's one group. Another group is acceptance, feeling accepted. So if you are excluded, if you are not empowered to speak up or share your ideas or thoughts or feelings or emotions, by being ignored, by being avoided, those are triggers. So no one's actually done any body language to you, right, said any words. It's now a series of actions.
Yeah, it's like a human betrayal to be excluded.
Right? So now you're ignored, and then, again, how do you have if you feel like you're excluded, avoided, ignored, how do you have the conversation with that person without feeling like you're high maintenance, without feeling like you're needy? And then that's, again, where it comes back to emotional intelligence. So I want you, as you reflect, to think about, look, the way you can reach me at MindsetGo, my name is Mark Altman. The number is 978-206-1535. And my email address, you can either email at info@mindsetgo.com or certainly reach out to me personally at maltman@mindsetgo.com. But these days, I'm helping high school students, college students, teachers, CEOs, leadership teams, sales teams, organizations overall. Everybody needs help with their conversational and emotional intelligence.
Well, I may have to contact you and get a little help with the homework for next week.
Absolutely, yes. If you need help with the homework, please contact me as well. So thank you again for joining us for another edition of the Mindset Go radio show, all about conversation intelligence. We'll see you next week.